Hi guys, I'm Sorita. I've got a lot to live up now to with that massive introduction. I'm here in, for a change, a sunny Glastonbury in England, and I've been out in the garden all day, so just excuse my fingernails if they do come up on screen. I know nothing, it's the fairies. It's just very muddy, and a lot of things need to be done in the garden. So it's my absolute pleasure to be here today and to present to you. I'm going to be speaking to you primarily about a topic that's really close to my heart, and no doubt I will probably bring Hecate into it a lot because I am a devotee of Hecate, and if I can find a reason to bring Hecate into things, I will probably diverge and go off onto many different tangents. So excuse me if I do, but hopefully it won't be dull or boring if I do decide to go off or just accidentally find myself going off on a complete and utter tangent. So can I share my screen? Yes,
Yes. Go right.
It's not been enabled for me.
Oh, there you go.
Right, let's see. Because I think it's always easier to have these things with a few pictures along the way. So hopefully everybody will be able to see this, and it will make it a little bit more interesting than just looking at me and my dusty books and things behind me. So the topic of my talk is the women who spoke for the gods, and in particular women who acted as oracles for the deities. Now, we know a little bit about some of them, we know stories, we even know a few names of some of the individuals that provided some of these oracles over the years. But it's not really their names that matter. Just like in some bizarre way, it's not our names that matter. It's kind of what is passed on and how we influence history, how we change the world that ultimately makes a difference. Those breadcrumbs that have just been mentioned as well, there's little things that just seem to kind of survive throughout the ages. And with the oracles, what we do know is there's some fantastic stories that maybe gives us an insight into both the characters of the women who performed these sacred duties, but also the ways in which they suffered. They were very powerful sometimes, especially in the case of, for example, the Pythia at Delphi, who I probably talk about quite a lot because it's the most famous, and a lot of our other oracles were described as being just, well, they just did it like they did it at Delphi. And so it's a kind of interesting way of kind of understanding how the oracles worked by understanding Delphi. So on screen right now is a quote from a colleague of mine, Belinus, who wrote that in an anthology that I edited way back in 2008. It's not in print anymore, called Priestesses, Pythionesses and Sybils. So this little book was dedicated to a friend of mine, Helen, who sadly passed away only a couple of weeks after the book was published. So one day I would like to do another version of this anthology, and this anthology brought together at the time, so back in 2008, the voices of different women who acted as priestesses or as oracles in their various traditions. And back then it was a subject that wasn't very much discussed. Things have changed a lot in the last 15 years, but it's still a topic that is slightly kind of difficult, right? Because is it true? Is somebody faking it? Should you listen to it? Should you listen to the predictions you get? And somehow an oracle is a lot more mysterious than getting a tarot reading. But a tarot reading is still an oracle. It's just a different type of oracle. So in the ancient world, the Neoplatonists, who's part of the late antiquity, the late pagan period, they distinguish between two types of oracle. The oracles that came straight from the gods, which would be the mantic voices of the priestesses, and on occasion there were male voices that spoke for the gods as well as dreams, because dreams were like a divinely inspired thing. The gods could communicate directly with any of us by sending us a dream. So dreams and oracles that came through a kind of mantic, a priestess that could speak for the gods, were considered to be divine, and they were considered to be the best. They were the best form of divination, the best form of oracles. Next to that, we had the so-called kind of technical oracles, which is oracles that are coming through a particular technique being employed. So tarot cards, although they're not from the ancient world in that way, would be a form of that. It's a form of oracle that comes through an intermediary. So casting the bones, rolling dice. These were popular forms of the more technical form of divination. So they distinguished between these two types. So when Bellina wrote these words in her essay, she was describing the experience of trance, the experience of becoming a priestess for, or the voice of the god Apollo, because Apollo is the voice that most of these priestesses spoke in their oracles. There's a kind of complicated relationship in regards to gender, and I'll talk a little bit about that in due course. But so when she's referring to Leto's glorious son, she's referring to Apollo. And Apollo is important because almost all the very famous oracles were dedicated to Apollo during the kind of classical period of European history. These words on screen are actually my own from 2001, and it was an oracle that happened at Wayland's Smithy, which is an ancient Neolithic burial chamber in Oxfordshire. And as quite a young priestess, I was taken there with a group of people. People were doing a kind of oracular ritual as part of a dedication to the goddess Hecate. And these were the words that came through, and somebody wrote them down afterwards. So they're not I don't consider them my words. I consider them the words of Hecate. But for me, they kind of also sum up something about the way in which maybe oracles should be interpreted. These words are far wiser than I think I was 20, I don't want to say how old I was at the time because it makes me very old now, but I was young. And the point is that for me, they still summarize the way in which maybe we should understand oracles, which at the time, I don't believe I had that wisdom. So I do not believe that they're my words. So the reason I'm telling you this is because I think we can become intellectual about oracles, and we can kind of get stuck on strange details and, interpretations or somebody's interpretation. Whereas I think it's something that we need to, that kind of idea of seeking beauty and speaking to the soul, not the mind. So we've got to feel the way in which oracles should be interpreted and maybe also how they should be spoken. But throughout history, there has been many, many rules. So let's go and have a look at a few of these different oracles. So this is a beautiful quote from a poem called Gentian by Elizabeth Green Crane. And I feel that, again, it kind of summarizes something of that ability to be a priestess and the feeling of what it is. And she wrote, about that altar lone, the crowding stomach burned with steady fire. Stomach is a type of incense. Before it stately stood a priestess, one, who turned to me her melancholy eyes. I saw her beauty, ripe with colour's breath, yet veiled, as when on wood and hill there lies a mist, a shadow, as of coming death. So this is not modern, just showing that kind of continuation of the interest in the oracles. And here we've got quite an ancient quote describing what essentially is the same kind of thing as those modern quotes I started with. This is a writer writing in Ephesus and writing about the oracle there. So the most famous oracle was at Delphi, but there were actually oracles at a lot of sites. And one thing that is slightly peculiar, and there are reasons for it, is that not all the gods necessarily had oracles. There were particular deities, Apollo and Zeus being two of those, but there are also others, Hera, Hecate, Artemis, who frequently had oracles, and then more kind of geographically specific oracles belonging to particular deities that maybe wasn't part of their universal cult. And again, here we've got the Sybil. Sybil's another word for the Pythia or the oracle, and the Sybil is a more Roman word, really. So the translator here has probably taken a bit of liberty with it. But the mantic, the Sybil, with raving lips uttering things mirthless, unbedizened and unperfumed, reaches over 1,000 years with a voice, thanks to the god in her. So again, that kind of idea, even in antiquity, that the idea of a woman speaking for and kind of going into a slight frenzied state, the raving lips, the uttering things that are mirthless, that even in antiquity, this was considered to be something that was very ancient. It wasn't something new to them. It wasn't something specific to them. It's something that existed, you know, in a much wider geographic area. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to, for those of you that are very, very geeky, this is a very good book. It's a very boring book. It's called Oracles of the Ancient World, and it's a list of many, many oracles, and it's like a travel guide, if you like. It's not a particularly exciting or mystical book, and it's by somebody called Trevor Kernow. And this actually lists a lot of the kind of more obscure oracles in all kinds of places: Egypt, Mesopotamia, Turkey, Italy, Greece, you know, so kind of all over that area of the kind of Mediterranean, Aegean Sea region where these oracles flourished and where we know the most famous ones from. So let's talk a little bit about the Pythia of Delphi. You can probably see that behind me I've got a print of this image that's on screen. It's a favorite of mine, and it depicts the Oracle of Delphi sitting on her very famous tripod chair. So very specifically, it's a very peculiar, specific, factual thing that she's always shown as sitting on this tripod chair. It's never a chair with 4 legs or 5 legs, or she's not just standing. She's always sitting on this tripod. And there's always something to do with fumes rising associated with her, and also the laurel. And there might be reasons for this. So the speculation about the fumes that she may or may not have been breathing in is that it might have been a gas escaping from a chasm in the kind of rocks at the Temple of Apollo in Delphi, which is a beautiful, beautiful site. If you ever get the opportunity to go there, it's really... I don't know, it's like one of those sites that still has something of the magic to it, even though a lot of tourists go there. Whereas some places are kind of like, okay, that's interesting, but you know, yeah. The site at Delphi is incredibly magical, and I've got a really interesting experience for my first time that I went there. That I made a wish just as we came into the valley, which was granted in a very, very unusual way later that evening. But I won't digress right now. So the laurel, of course, is a symbol of victory, but it's also a kind of a plant that we get associated with the mysteries a lot. And from laurel, not a lot of people know this, you can extract an oil which burns, and it's a menthol oil, and you can use it as a fuel. It's medicinal. It's got a lot of medicinal properties. It burns fantastic if you ever want to make a torch or just a little mini firework from it. But also the fumes can be slightly psychedelic. So there is a bit of a theory that maybe she was breathing a lot of laurel that was burning. But there's a lot of different stories about the foundation of Delphi, which gives us clues to what it may have been. The earth gas idea is plausible, but there's a lot of stories that seem to be saying it was a much more natural gift, or maybe something that was trained into her, that she learned how to do this. So in the 1st century CE, Plutarch wrote about the woman who now serves the god, who, if anyone was born here lawfully and properly, and it was lived a well-ordered life, but brought up in the house of poor peasants, she goes down to the shrine, equipped with nothing in the way of technical skills or any other experience or ability. So he's talking about the 1st century CE, and this doesn't mean that all the women who served there were poor peasants. By the 1st century CE, Delphi was in decline. So when we look at any of these historical facts that come to us, we've always got to kind of think, well, where did it come from? Who wrote it? What time period? And what was going on in the world in that moment in time? Just like our decisions today might be influenced by political goings on, or war, or financial goings on, or even just personal things that happen in our lives. You know, there's an explanation usually for something. So at this time, when Plutarch was writing, they only had one priestess serving at any one time at Delphi. But in just a couple of centuries before this, we actually find that there were 3 women serving at any one time as the Pythia at the same time. So they were kind of on a relay. You know, one would serve, then the other one, and one would be the kind of spare for if something went wrong with one of the other 2. So there'd always be like a rotation of 3 of these women. And we know that the words that they spoke sometimes changed the course of history, quite literally. And these women were capable of communicating with quite high up officials, rulers, kings, generals. So it's not believed by everybody who studies this that they were all poor peasant girls that were just randomly selected. There's a lot of people that believe that actually they were trained, maybe that they went to the temple when they were very young and educated there. That's possible, because that would not be unusual, actually. For example, young girls were often dedicated to the cult of Artemis when they were merely little, 5-6-year-old girls, sometimes younger, because Artemis looked after all the virgin girls. So, quite often these girls would go and train with that temple, and Apollo, of course, being her brother. So I have to throw a little bit of Hecate in because I can't help myself. Something that's not talked about enough. So I throw this in every single time I talk about Delphi now, because I think it would be great if other people started looking at this and researching it, and maybe something more will come from it if more people are focused on it. So what you're seeing on the right-hand side is a replica of the so-called navel stone, or the omphalos. Now, this in itself is a really interesting characteristics of Delphi, but also of several of the other sites linked to oracles, and I'll explain why in a second. Including Ephesus actually had something to do with this particular thing, because the omphalos was likely originally a meteoric stone, so a bytilic stone, bytilis being another word for the meteoric stones, that literally a shooting star coming to Earth. Now, the reason that there is a navel stone at Delphi is because there's this story, one of the many legends of the founding of Delphi, telling us that there was a debate about where the center of the world was, because, that's important. I don't know why that was important, but it was important to a bunch of ancient dudes. So the god Zeus, and Zeus just means God, so we've got to kind of distinguish between Zeus of mythology, the kind of character that goes around making babies that become future leaders, kings, warriors, and stuff with various women in slightly bizarre ways sometimes, and sometimes unpleasant ways, and the kind of idea of the god Zeus, because these two characters are quite separate sometimes in Greek religion and Anatolian religion as well, because Zeus simply is like Dios, it just means God. So it's said that Zeus sent his 2 eagles from the corners of the world, and where they met was where Delphi is now. So that's one of the stories, so hence that being the navel, the belly button of the world. But this stone played a really, really important role at Delphi. And it's not clear why. We don't have a lot of information about exactly what happened there. It's impossible to ignore the fact that it's similar to the lingam, the penis type stones that and rocks and carvings that they've got in India. So I've actually, when I was at Delphi, the first time, there was an Indian family that was completely thrown by seeing something like this at a Western site, and started praying, which was quite an interesting experience for me, seeing that. But what is fascinating is this figure on the left, which anybody familiar with Hecate will know that this looks like Hecate. The images of the carvings at the back are actually life-size or slightly larger than life-size. They're all about 6 foot something. This figure is larger, much larger, and it's 3 women all standing in this distinctive pose, all crowned with a polos. Now, the polos is an interesting headdress that we associate with Hecate, but also with Artemis and Persephone specifically. And also with the Near Asian goddesses. So polos comes from the word for pole, and it's linked to the kind of tree cults of deities such as Asherah, which some of you will be familiar with from the Bible. You know, so Asherah is sometimes named as the wife of God. And, you know, so this is kind of slightly curious that these Greek deities should have this, but of course it's all the same region. So ideas and information and cult practices and stuff merged and came together. So Hecate is frequently either shown crowned with it or standing, as she is also in this, around a central pole, which is a direct link to that pole cult, which made it quite popularly into Anatolia and all kinds of areas, because it's directly next to where the original cults were, so it's not unusual to find that. What is interesting is that originally the drawing on the left is a reconstruction of what this thing would be like. So you can see there's a human-sized person standing in my photograph on the right, just to give you a sense of the scale of what this statue is. Now, Delphi's museum has officially just got this labeled as the dancers, which is a bit nutty because this is the largest statue that stood at Delphi, and it's a female statue. And it, in my opinion, and in the opinion of maybe other people, this is Hecate. There's just no reason to doubt it, because you're not going to have just dancing girls depicted in such a large statue. Moreover, if you look at the drawing on the left-hand side, you'll notice that this statue supported on top of it the omphalos, and that it stood underneath the tripod of Delphi, the oracular seat. So this triple dancing girls, you know, because I've got to call it dancing girls because that's what Delphi calls it, supported the oracle seat. And on top of the oracle seat, that I'm just going to go back one, the left-hand side is the original part from that that column. So that stood on top of her, and then right at the top you've got a wreath for victory. This was a massive monument. If you look at the size of the dancing girls on the right-hand side, and then you imagine that that's only a little bit of this column. This column was massive. It was the same height as the apex of the roof of the temple of Apollo outside which it stood. So the female influence at Delphi was there. The statue didn't stand for long. This pole, this pillar didn't stand for long. It collapsed during an earthquake. But it was notably also given by the people of Athens as a gift to the people of Delphi about 10 years after Pausanias wrote that there was a triple statue of Hecate erected at the Parthenon in Athens. So this was during the time that the triple image of Hecate became very popular. Hecate is also very closely associated with Apollo and with Zeus, who's got a connection to the Oracle of Delphi, as well as with Phoebe, who was the goddess who also was the goddess of the Oracle prior to Apollo, but before the Pythia, the serpents that kind of guarded the site. And she's also directly linked to Gaia. It's all the same bit of the family tree that we usually get given in the various theologies and theogonies of the gods of that time. So there's a very direct link there. I'm not just kind of babbling on about Hecate because I love Hecate, but it's a very significant thing that needs more looking at and more exploration, in my opinion. So let me just say a little bit about the founding of Delphi here. The Oracle of Delphi was founded variously according to different stories, because somebody observed a goat going a little bit crazy, or a woman kind of sitting and having experiences. So a lot of information points to the fact that Delphi itself had something that was special about it. So this could be the kind of rising earth gases that sent them and made them high or made them frenzied. But not all the descriptions of these women speaking for Apollo describes them as crazy. A lot of them describe them as speaking in poetic ways. They shared things that really influenced the future of the world, and they weren't always completely forthcoming. There were sometimes riddles and things like that associated with it, but not all the descriptions talk about the women as being kind of incomprehensibly like somebody that was high or off their heads. It's a much more gentle interpretation. And also another thing, there's later stories about priests interpreting the voices of these women. The only stories about that is from very late antiquity. There's no evidence that this happened in the early years of the oracle. And the oracle may have originally been dedicated to Gaia, the earth goddess, or Phoebe, the goddess of light, which of course Hecate is also Phoebe. She's also described as Phoebe because she's a torchbearer. So there's a very direct link there with various of the female deities as well. So another very well-known story of a oracle linked also to Apollo is kind of a whole jump in history, because the Oracle of Delphi was already very well established by the 6th, 7th century BCE. And we know that it continued, but in a kind of very sad state by the end of it, to the 4th century, when it finally closed its doors. But the Sibyl of the kind of Roman world, there's this whole tradition of Sybils, is a slightly different kettle of fish. There was also a lot of very famous ones. The Sibyl of Cumae is kind of interesting because we've got a story about Apollo falling in love with her because she was so beautiful. She had this amazing gift of prophecy. So again, you've got this connection to this god of prophecy. He's also, interestingly, the god of music and inspiration. So it could just be like a muse type experience that these women were experiencing, that's described as being this love affair with Apollo. But the Sibyl of Cumae refused to get involved with Apollo, and Apollo made her gifts. Apollo tried to woo her, completely failed. And there's this wonderful story, so lots of wonderful stories about her, in fact, where Apollo offers her a wish and she asks him for immortality, but she still won't run away with him. So Apollo, being a bit more respectful than some of the other gods, obviously doesn't ravish her or anything, but he kind of punishes her by letting her wither away until she becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. And eventually she just becomes a voice in a bottle. But the Sibyls of Rome had some very peculiar things that happened, because they were so powerful in the late Roman Republic that during the kind of rise of Christianity, because they're kind of still popular during that time, they find their way into Christianity. And there's all these amazing stories that we've got about them. So Virgil wrote a lot about them, for example. And here he's likening the experience of Apollo kind of coming into her like that of a horse and a rider. So her being ridden essentially by Apollo. So not just the love affair kind of experience. We've also got Michelangelo here on the right-hand side. She actually makes it into cathedrals and chapels. So these women that were definitely working with the gods and the goddesses of the ancient world, they were powerful enough that when Christianity came to, on the rise, and they were trying to extinguish all these oracles, that the Christians actually started incorporating them. The Sibyl of Cumae being probably the one that got incorporated the most. And we've got these kind of depictions of her and her books, because the Sibylline oracles were written down, but there's 2 sets of Sibylline oracles. The originals are believed to be completely lost. And then the later Sibylline oracles, so like if you Google it or you look it up, more likely you're looking at a Christian invention that was basically created to meet a need and kind of slightly trick people into believing that the Sybils predicted Christ, and that the Sybils therefore how do you say, kind of approved of the whole thing. You know, that they predicted it, therefore it must be a good thing. So it was part of the process of trying to convert people, you know, for several centuries. This went on, and really the church and the state worked really hard to try and distinguish all of these things. Now, the other story that I love about the Cumaean Sibyl is this one, which is that the Delphic Oracle sometimes wrote things in verse, and it led to lots of misunderstandings. But the Cumaean Sibyl was crazier. She wrote all her predictions on leaves, and the querent had to sit outside. This is in Italy, by the way, modern day Italy. And the querent had to sit outside her cave, and when she was ready to answer them, she'd take these leaves with all the words written on it, and she'd just scatter it outside of the cave. So the querent would have to, sometimes they had people with them to try and grab all the leaves that the words were on, and then they had to try and piece it back together, which, as you can kind of guess, led to a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of reinterpretation, because you didn't know which order the words had to be in, and you didn't know whether you lost a word. So it kind of probably led to a lot of quite interesting situations. So all of these women had different ways of producing their oracles. So I just thought I'd include this as the Phrygian Sibyl, but these are just some of the Christian depictions later on. You can see some of them are actually holding crosses nearly, of the famous Sibyls of the ancient world that the Christians kind of incorporated. So there were many of them, and there's some beautiful images of them as well. So here's another, the other 6, there's 12 that are usually distinguished above the others. So there's a lot of stories about where this information may have come from, and the Christians in particular kind of had this idea that all of the oracles had to come from God. And so, like I said, they kind of rewrote the stories of these female prophetesses, of these mantic voices, as if they must have been voices for God, because it's the only explanation. So this is just one of the many ways that they tried to kind of incorporate it and make it okay, in an effort to incorporate that into their kind of rising religion. So here we've got Apollo with his blackbird. He's got his lyre and stuff. He's a kind of handsome fella. He gets a bit of bad press, I think, sometimes in the goddess movement, possibly because, you know, he's a bloke, and some of it is to do with this story at the Delphic Oracle. And I think one thing that is worth of saying and worth looking into, if you've got some doubts about, you know, the idea that the women spoke on behalf of Apollo, is to remember that he was also part of a lineage of deities, you know, according to the myths. So his auntie was Phoebe, you know, so there's this lineage of gods taking, and the Pythia was actually hunted down by Apollo, not on a random mission to take over Delphi. So it's worth looking into the story of the birth of Apollo and his twin sister Artemis, and then kind of looking at what they did subsequently, because this hunting of the Pythia is ascribed to a story where their mother, the goddess Leto, who's just supposed to be the good goddess, there's not very much else said about her, she basically is pregnant by Zeus when Zeus fails to impregnate his sister Asteria. So both of them are virgin goddesses at this point, and the god Zeus pursues Asteria. Asteria later becomes the mother of Hecate, so this other link there to Hecate for those of you interested in Hecate. And when he pursues Asteria, she shapeshifts into different animals and then throws herself into the ocean and becomes an island. And that island today is the island of Delos in Greece. And it was called Ortygia after the bird, the quail, that she turned herself into before becoming this floating island. And Apollo and Artemis were both born on this island, and there's this whole story associated with it. Before Leto makes it there, Hera curses her, Hera being the wife of Zeus, curses her, so she can't give birth on solid ground. And on her journey, trying to find a sanctuary, a safe space to give birth to her unborn children, she goes to Delphi because it's a place that belongs to her family. But the Pythia chases her on behest of Hera, even though it's a sacred place. So when Artemis and Apollo goes back and Apollo then slays the python, the serpent, it's as revenge for their pregnant mother having been chased away from there. So it's a very kind of interesting way in which it's explained. And, you know, you've got to kind of look at these things and think, well, you know, it could be factual, maybe it's not factual, maybe it's just a story to tell about the different dynasties of rulers coming in. You know, there's lots of different explanations for it, all of which is kind of interesting. Oh, I was going to just say one more thing about Delphi. I can go on about Delphi for a long time. For those of you wondering where the name Delphi comes from, did anybody wonder where the name Delphi comes from? I don't know. It actually means dolphin. Now, I wonder how many of you actually knew that it means dolphin, and it's from a strange story, and which is interesting because I know a lot of you probably have been to Crete or want to go to Crete, the beautiful island of, you know, the Minoan snake goddesses and all these kinds of things. So the story is that it was a Cretan ship sailing, and that a dolphin basically jumped into the ship, and the dolphin is a Apollo shapeshifts, and one of the forms that Apollo takes is the form of a dolphin. So it's one of his titles. He doesn't have the title because of the site of Delphi. He has the title because of the meaning of dolphin, and that the dolphin actually spoke to these Cretans and told them to go and create this oracular site to Apollo at the site that is now Delphi. So it's a completely different story from the story of Zeus and his eagles and the belly button or the meteoric stones. There's a lot of different stories explaining Delphi. It can be quite fascinating to kind of explore more of it, but we're probably going to run out of time if I talk about Delphi the whole day long. So, okay, so here we've got an example of something that the Oracle of Delphi spoke, and this time she was speaking to King Croesus. Now, Croesus, like all good, clever men, thought he was very good and clever, and that he could basically get the upper hand in understanding the Oracle. So what he did is he was a very wealthy king from the coast of Anatolia. This little kingdom, a powerful kingdom at the time called Lydia. And Croesus decided that, yeah, not all the oracles were equal. He needed to find out which oracle was the cleverest. So he decided to send people to consult the oracle on a particular day. And that all these people had to ask the oracle a very specific question, which is, what is King Croesus doing now, right now? So all these blokes went out with their posses and consulted the various oracles. There are many oracles that they consulted. And the king decided to do something very untypical for a king. He decided to cook a very strange dish in a very strange way in the moment that these people were consulting the oracle. And it was only the Oracle of Delphi that gave a 100% accurate answer. So Croesus, having discovered that Delphi knows what she's talking about, went personally to consult the Oracle at Delphi. And what he wanted to know was whether or not he should invade the kingdom of Persia. So Persia, of course, at the time, a very powerful kingdom. And he wanted to, rule over everything because he was a bit power hungry. And so when he consulted the oracle, she told him a few things, but notably she said, if you cross the river, a great empire will be destroyed. Croesus, believing that the Oracle of Delphi is the bee's knees and that she knows what she's talking about, failed to really think about which kingdom this would be. And naturally, when he crossed the river to invade Persia, it was his kingdom, his empire that fell forever. There was no, just kind of ended the whole kind of idea of Lydia at that point. So there's this kind of typical thing, is a little bit like you see with the Sibyl of Crimea, like hundreds of years later, where the same kind of thing happens. So just a few things before I run out of time. I've still got some time, right? Yes. About how the oracles were consulted. I love this painting. It's by Waterhouse. Great. This is actually an oracle of a kind of dismembered head. There was quite a few oracles like this in the ancient world. The most famous being the head of Orpheus that was chopped off by the Maenads that kind of lost their cool with him, and his head drifted down the river, was found, and apparently went on speaking oracles that were interpreted by a female mantic voice that could understand what this head was telling people. So there were particular ways in which the questions were asked. And actually, if you went to Delphi, and like I said, Delphi was the model for a lot of these other sites, you actually spend time learning how to ask your question. So I guess it's where we get this saying still today in modern pagan magical circles, goddess circles, of be careful what you ask for. Well, it was more like a question of be careful how you ask it. Like in Croesus, he should have said, hey, will I survive? Will I be the victor? Instead, he got this vague answer that made him believe. So typical questions would be asked in a way that the answer had to be yes, no, or who did it, or who will do it. What the chances for success was, the outcome for action, advice, and solutions to problems. Typically, these were the same kind of things that people go today still to kind of tarot readers for, I guess, you know, when will I find a husband? Will I get the job? You know, so there's a lot of those same kind of questions if you look at it. So again, I just digress into Hecate, because she had a famous oracle on the island of Sicily where this image is from. There was a temple there to Persephone and Demeter at a place called Selinunte, which now finally is getting a lot of research done to it. It's a very big site and fascinating because it's got a Punic kind of Eastern influence there, and it's a very early site. But Porphyry recorded an oracle of Hecate here, which is typical of a lot of the oracles that happened in the late pagan, early Christian period, where the oracle was asked about Jesus. And it's difficult to know, of course, whether this is later propaganda or, you know, whether this really happened. But Porphyry seemed to have written a lot of stuff down, and he consulted a lot of oracles. He also wrote some very kind of dangerous texts of its time. For example, he wrote a tract called Against the Christians, which was literally attacked by the Christians and burned by pretty much anybody that kind of got a hold of a copy. The church sought to destroy and managed to destroy all copies of it. So a lot of Porphyry's work suffered like that. So we've got to assume that he was at least pious in his desire to represent the old gods of the time properly. And he recorded both these things as well. And he also had this oracle, like I said, about Jesus that he recorded, where the oracle spoke and said that Jesus was a good man, but she's not so sure about his followers. But what I kind of like in particular here is that there are taboos when it came to the oracles. And the first one here talks a little bit about that, in that the oracle was being consulted at a time that was not astrologically suitable for an oracle. So there were particular times associated with the oracles, or particular numbers of days that the oracles were open, or times that you really shouldn't consult the oracles. So there were rules. It wasn't just anything goes, you know, there were really particular things. So here she's talking about, I do not speak, the oracle said, I shall shut the gates of the long throat. So the long throat is quite an interesting way of thinking of the oracle coming not from here, but from somewhere deeper, you know, coming up maybe from the earth or from some mysterious place. For in the night, the horn goddess Titania, so that would be the moon, drives towards the most unpropitious gods of night, looking at malignant Aries. So it's basically a moon Aries alignment, moon Mars alignment that's not propitious. at this particular moment in time. And we've also got this other oracle here, which is more about, you know, how you should ask and you know, all those kinds of things, but I will kind of move on. Another very famous site linked to an oracle is Miletos, which is in modern day Turkey, but it was part of the Greek world. Miletos, which we don't talk about a lot today, I guess because it's in Turkey and it's a little bit more obscure today, was just as famous as Delphi, nearly. And it was also a site of Apollo. And here again, we've got this worship to Hecate very prominently included, where there's a black stone that the Morpoi, which is a type of Persian type priest, they were carrying these stones and kind of putting it down periodically and worshipping it as Hecate. And again, this black stone here could have been a meteoric stone, which is also the stone that was at the center of the Temple of Artemis of Ephesus. So this kind of black stone, this vitilic stone, the star stone, something coming down from the heavens, seems to be a strong connection to a lot of oracular sites. And we find them also at some of the oracle sites associated with the dead and with dice and bones and, you know, all kinds of things. So this kind of site of something to do with the heavens coming down. Okay, so Crete, I've mentioned as being linked to Apollo through this story of the dolphin. So the Cretans actually going and establishing the oracles there. So at Crete, there's a couple of stone-cut thrones, one of which is on display, and then there's another one that there's just a replica, which is in the so-called throne room. And it's possible that those were oracular thrones for priestesses, especially young priestesses, because one thing that we have with a lot of the oracular cults is that the women who acted as the voices of the gods were not often mature women. They were very frequently young, virgin, and virgin in the kind of untouched by a man sense. They were, you know, not sexually active yet, women that behaved as oracles. At Delphi, there was an example of one of these priestesses being attacked and raped, because mankind is like that. And then after that, the authorities at Delphi decided to take action. So it kind of hints at the idea that it wasn't the first or the only time that this happened, but that they finally decided to take action, in my opinion. And then after that, it became a woman who was post-menopause, who was menopausal basically, and that then also became celibate. So celibacy, abstaining from sexual activity, was a very big part of a lot of the oracle, not all of them, but a lot of the oracle sites, you find this emphasis on celibacy, like abstaining from sexual activity. Which is something that even modern day, like occultists that practice things like sex magic rather than the more tantric stuff, the more kind of hardcore stuff, a lot of them will also abstain from sex for a period of time. So this idea of holding onto your power may be something to do with that, maybe something to do just with the fact that it took away the possibility that she would be pregnant and have to go away. You know, so there's lots of different reasons why that may have been. So I've talked a lot about Apollo already. He was kind of a handsome, slightly effeminate god, lots of music, lots of beautiful things. The oracle I haven't touched on is another oracle linked to Zeus. Now, it's kind of also one of those sites that were really, really famous, but also the origins of which aren't linked to the god Zeus. It's linked to a story which is summarized. The quote is at the bottom of the screen, which I hope people can see, which is all to do with these two black doves that leaves Thebes in Egypt, and one goes to Libya and the other one goes to Dodona. Now Libya, and Cyrene in particular in Libya, which I really like to go to in this lifetime, so, you know, let there be peace so that I can go, was a very famous site linked to Demeter and Persephone and Hecate, and was also an oracular site. The temple ruins are still there. I've got a friend who because of his mother's work going there as a small boy when things were a little bit safer, and it really influenced a lot of his work. It's a, you know, so the only kind of photographs I've ever seen really is secondary, and I'd really like to go there one of these days. But the story of this is a little bit different, because we don't know at Dodona whether it was priestesses that spoke, doves that spoke, or that there was some kind of sound that came and was emitted by the site. So Dodona is very unique because it existed before Delphi. It existed alongside Delphi. It was sacred to Zeus, but alongside Zeus, they had this goddess called Dodona, which there's not very much known about. She seems to be somewhere between the kind of mother goddess of Rhea, the more ancient form of Hecate, something to do maybe with Diana, the god, the kind of huntress. She's a goddess of somewhere, because she shares a lot of those qualities. And she specifically was honored just here at Dodona. But this story about these two doves coming flying, two black doves, it could be black women maybe from some kind of African cult, one going to Libya and one coming to Greece, establishing the whatever the cult was there. But what we do know is that the idea that the messages came and that the site was established because of these priestesses really was very important. It was enough for the dove to be depicted on the coins from Dodona, which I said was a very, very important site for a very long time. And there was this kind of constant service of priestesses there. But the oracle here was not spoken by a woman's voice. It was established by women, but it was spoken by methods we don't understand. Some people say that the voice of the god, the divine oracle, came through just listening to the sound of the oak trees that stood at Dodona, which was the kind of variety of it's called holm oak. It's an evergreen oak. It's not like the oaks we've got in England that drops its leaves, which I suspect is the ones you've probably got in the US. And so it's an evergreen set, and it's got a slightly kind of harder leaf, so it does make a rustling sound, so you can see where that comes from. Some people think that it might have been things hanging in the trees that behaved a little bit like kind of tinkly things that just made a sound and that you could listen to it. And there was also a story about very large cauldrons in a circle or in a half circle, depending on who you believe, at the site, which emitted a sound which makes me think a little bit of like singing bowls, like the Tibetan singing bowl idea, you know, so this kind of cross-cultural idea, maybe the sound came from that. But Dodona, very worthwhile kind of investigating and looking into a little bit more as well. I've talked a little bit about things being forbidden, for example, the kind of astrology, but Hera also, the Oracle of Hera specifically forbidden oracles being consulted in the mornings. I like this as a kind of rule, because, you know, I know a lot of us just don't want to get up first thing in the morning. So, you know, not a bad thing there. We've got also this idea of inauspicious and auspicious days, which is also something we find not just in Greece and in Rome and in Anatolia, but also in Egypt, where some days is good. This particular oracle, and the reason we know the story is a little bit sad, because the priests forced the oracle, this is the oracle, the Pythia at Delphi, to perform an oracle on a day that wasn't auspicious. And as a result of that, she went into a very unfortunate, negative way of having a trance. It was very intense, and she died a few days later. So there was a kind of real danger, not just perceived as being associated with the wrong day. This idea, of course, at Delphi might just indicate that maybe the gases were stronger on some days as well, if it was a gas. Just a kind of worthwhile, I don't know, a side thought there. Okay, so we've got lots and lots of examples of the oracles at different sites and in different places, and I can probably go on forever talking about it. But let's just talk a little bit about the commune Sybil, and then I will take questions and talk to you all about what you want to know. Maybe the commune Sybil had 3 scrolls with the books of the Sybils and the wise words that were consulted as a way of understanding the oracles. And she went to a king, and she demanded a very high price for her oracles. And the king kind of laughed her off. And the Sybil took one of the scrolls and she chucked it in the fire, to the shock and horror of everybody. And the king asked her why she did it, and she kind of just laughed, and she said, well, you can buy the remaining 2 from me now. And she demanded an even higher price. And again, the king and his men laughed, and she threw it in one of the remaining 2 into the fire. In the end, the king paid a lot more for that remaining scroll because of the confidence that she had in what she had on offer, which I think is a kind of story that is something that as women, we've got to kind of hear a lot more. I'm wearing this pendant today because I bought it from a very beautiful Peruvian girl who sells her goodies here in Glastonbury. It's handmade. And when I bought it from her, she kind of started apologizing for how much it cost. And it wasn't really particularly expensive, in my opinion, because it's all handmade, hand embroidered, hand knotted, and it must have taken her hours. And, for me, it kind of symbolizes that we've got to value what we do and what we've got on offer, and that we've got to be willing to support each other, but also to find value in what we've got to offer. The Sybils had no qualms. They spoke their truth. They sometimes suffered for speaking their truth. Some of them ended with kind of very bad ways. Bad things did happen to them sometimes, but they still changed the course of history through their predictions about war, through the wisdom that they shared with ordinary people as well as with rulers in general. So I think as a new generation of priestesses coming through now, we've got to really kind of embrace that power and value what we've got on offer. And valuing something doesn't mean necessarily putting a monetary value on it, but knowing where we spend our time, how we give ourselves to others. So anyway, thank you very much for listening to my ramblings about the oracles. Is there any questions? Or is there time for questions?
Thank you so much, Sorita. This was amazing. I'm going to just stop your share, and we're going to invite folks to put their questions into the chat window so that then you can answer in the chat. And I've already ordered a copy of that book that you suggested, The Oracles of the Ancient World. I definitely suggest, friends, that you not order it from Amazon, that you look online for a secondhand copy, because on Amazon it's $70, but I got one for $15.
The other one is very good as this one, Omens and Oracles. It's also got a long list of reasonings and stuff behind it. And one day I can't see that. It's by somebody called Dylan, by Routledge.
Oh,
and yeah, there's a lot of more material now than there used to be. The best thing is really to go to the
Yes, exactly. And we're going to be, as a temple, going to some of these places later this year. And I so look forward to bringing the consciousness of what you've shared today. Thank you so much, Sorita.